Whenever you hear about the European witch trials, your brain immediately goes to the exact same stereotypical image: pointy hats, green skin, bubbling cauldrons, and a mob of superstitious peasants waving pitchforks because someone's neighbour looked at a goat the wrong way. We are taught to look back at this period of history as a temporary lapse in human sanity, a massive, inexplicable wave of religious hysteria where society collectively lost its mind for a few centuries. But if you look at how human beings actually operate, that narrative completely falls apart. Human societies do not systematically orchestrate the persecution of tens of thousands of people across multiple countries over the span of 300 years just because they are feeling a little bit spooked. You don't get a societal shift of that magnitude from a bad dream or a spooky folklore tale. You get it from a highly lucrative business model. To understand why a society suddenly turns on itself, you always have to start by looking at the environment. Between the 14th and 19th centuries, Europe was plunged into a devastating climatic anomaly known as the Little Ice Age. And we aren't just talking about having to wear an extra sweater. We are talking about absolute ecological chaos. Rivers that had flowed for centuries froze completely solid. Alpine glaciers aggressively expanded, literally crushing entire villages. But most importantly, the growing seasons were drastically shortened. In a pre-industrial agrarian society, your entire existence is tied to the harvest. If the crops fail for 1 year, things get tough. If they fail for 5 years in a row, you are looking at mass starvation. The biological stress on the European population was astronomical, and evolutionary psychology tells us exactly how human beings react when they are cold, hungry, and terrified. They look for a scapegoat. The human brain absolutely despises randomness. It hates the idea that invisible, uncontrollable weather patterns are destroying its food supply. It desperately needs a tangible enemy, someone it can point a finger at, blame, and remove from the equation to restore a sense of control. This isn't just a theory. Economists have actually mapped the data. Researcher Emily Oster published a fascinating study cross-referencing the historical records of the witch trials with the data on temperature fluctuations during the Little Ice Age. The results were a glaring mathematical truth. The years with the absolute lowest temperatures and the most devastating crop failures perfectly align with the most massive spikes in witchcraft accusations. When the weather was fine and bellies were full, nobody cared what the eccentric lady at the edge of the village was up to. But the second the wheat froze over, society needed a punching bag. But out of everyone in the village, why did the authorities specifically target older, unmarried women? To answer that, you have to look at the demographic nightmare that Europe had just survived. Before the trials really kicked into high gear, the continent was absolutely battered by the Black Death and the 100 Years' War. This created a massive, unprecedented shift in the population. Suddenly, there was a massive surplus of unmarried women and widows. For the first time in a long time, women were occupying spaces outside of the traditional family structure. Without a husband or a father acting as their legal guardian, many of these women had to find ways to support themselves. Some became highly successful merchants, others became brewers, and many took up spinning wool, which was such a lucrative, independent profession that the word spinster originally just meant a wealthy, self-sufficient woman before it was turned into an insult. But the real friction came down to one specific, highly valuable asset: land. Under many regional laws of the time, widows were legally allowed to inherit and manage their deceased husband's estate. In a society where owning land was the only reliable way to guarantee your survival and generate wealth, prime farming real estate was the ultimate prize. So picture the scenario. You have a woman living alone. She is sitting on a highly fertile, incredibly valuable piece of property, but she doesn't have a prominent husband, and she doesn't have a political safety net. In the eyes of a greedy opportunist, she is a walking target. This is where the legal system stepped in and created the most terrifying financial loophole in history. In many European jurisdictions, if a person was convicted of witchcraft, their entire estate was instantly confiscated. This was the mechanic that fueled the entire machine. Historians like Silvia Federici refer to this era as a period of primitive accumulation, the aggressive process of pushing vulnerable people off their land to consolidate wealth for the ruling class. If you wanted your neighbour's farmland, you didn't have to buy it. You just had to tell the local magistrate that you saw her flying over your barn or cursing your cattle. Once she was convicted, her assets were seized. Sometimes the property went directly to the state, sometimes it was absorbed by the church, and very often the accusers themselves were financially rewarded or given the opportunity to buy the land for pennies. But it gets even more calculated than that. The trials themselves were essentially a for-profit industry. In many regions, the accused were actually billed for their own imprisonment. If someone was accused of magic, the state would seize their bank account and use their own money to pay the guards who watched them, the judges who tried them, and even the cost of the wood used for their final sentence. It was a self-funding legal apparatus designed to drain an estate completely dry. You don't need supernatural hysteria to explain why the trials happened. You just need basic, unregulated human greed. But land and money were not the only things people were trying to steal. There was also a massive battle over professional dominance. For centuries leading up to this point, primary healthcare in rural Europe was almost entirely run by women. Midwives, botanists, and lay healers were the absolute backbone of the community. They possessed generations of practical knowledge. They knew how to use ergot to stop postpartum bleeding. They knew how to use belladonna as an anesthetic, and they were deeply, inherently trusted by the peasantry. But during the Renaissance, the medical landscape experienced a massive shift. Formal universities were established, and medicine was transformed into a highly academic, formalized, and strictly male-only profession. These new university-trained physicians wanted to establish themselves as the ultimate authorities on the human body. They wanted the prestige and they wanted the high fees. There was just one massive roadblock. Nobody wanted to use them. The new doctors were ridiculously expensive, deeply out of touch with the common people, and their methods were often terrifying. If you had a headache, the local midwife would give you willow bark, which contains the active ingredient in modern aspirin. The university doctor would apply leeches to your neck to balance your bodily humours. It is not hard to see why the peasants preferred the midwife. So, when a new industry cannot beat its competition in the free market, what is the next logical step? They use the law to make their competition illegal. Researchers Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English have thoroughly documented how the emerging medical establishment aligned itself with religious and state authorities. Together, they essentially rebranded generations of female botanical knowledge as a demonic practice. The logic they used was flawless in its cruelty. Since women were not legally allowed to attend universities, they could not possibly understand medicine. Therefore, if a woman successfully healed someone, she must be getting her power from dark, supernatural forces. By classifying traditional, accessible healthcare as magic, the male-dominated medical institutions systematically eliminated their only rivals. They secured a total monopoly on healthcare, ensuring their own financial and professional dominance for centuries to come. When we look back at historical events like the witch trials, it is very comforting to believe that people in the past were just less rational than we are today. It helps us sleep at night to think they were just blinded by spooky campfire stories and a lack of scientific reasoning. But when you strip away the folklore and examine the actual data, a much darker reality emerges. The trials were not a failure of human logic. They were a masterclass in human opportunism. When faced with starvation, extreme competition, and shifting power dynamics, society found a way to weaponize fear to achieve highly practical goals. They targeted women who held valuable land, women who held independent medical knowledge, and women who operated outside the traditional hierarchy. And they simply used the accusation of magic as the legal mechanism to take it all away. The terrifying truth about the witch trials isn't that people genuinely believed in magic. The terrifying truth is that they didn't have to. They just needed a legal excuse to take what wasn't theirs.